Okay, everyone, so good to be back with you. I know it's a long day to just sit and sit and sit some more, but I hope it's quite valuable to you, and it will continue to be so. So you'll be rewarded for your strength in sitting. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Duncan Morrow, who's with us from Belfast, Northern Ireland. And I'll say a few things about him. We can't say everything to be sure, but Duncan is a powerful public intellectual. He's written a lot about conflict transformation and peace building and healing, and yet he works a lot with the community and with the government in Northern Ireland. He's a liaison between the academic world and the government's efforts, or their improper efforts to advance peace building, and he works with religious organizations, and so he's done a lot of important things in addition to teaching, and I'll mention a few of them. He's been between 2002 and 2012 the chief executive of the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council, which in Northern Ireland is a very big thing. It's the primary institution that works hard in policy and procedure to listen to the voices of citizens in Northern Ireland and create what they call a shared future. And being impressed with that work, the Scottish government asked him to go up there and work with them in respect to some of the problems in Scotland that are similar. So he's been a chair of an independent ministerial advisory group in Scotland, tackling matters of sectarianism and hate crimes and prejudice and community cohesion there. Duncan has worked in the Balkans, in Colombia, and he's extraordinarily talented in this way of being a liaison between all kinds of communities, all kinds of peoples. Duncan is also a very important member of Corrymeela, which is the oldest peace-building organization in Northern Ireland and a model for peace-building organizations and community building around the world. And so when I take students to Northern Ireland, one of the persons there, of the many people we interact with, one of the persons who has the most impact on them, from whom they learn the most, is Duncan. And so it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Come on up, Duncan, and we appreciate you so much. Thank you.
That I wouldn't walk. Listening to the you're being introduced in America, it's always so generous, but it sometimes feels like your obituary. They're reading out all the things that they tell you that you've done, and actually, most of those things were happenstance. They happened to me because one thing led to another. There was no great plan. I have to say, there were great opportunities in my way, and I took a decision at an early time in my career that I had to do something in Northern Ireland because I lived there and I was from there, and that actually, if I was talking about peace and conflict, I needed to actually do a little bit of learning where I was, because it was the one place where I actually had the possibility to extend my horizons outside the university. Because instead of being an academic in the sense of having to produce simply papers for my peers, I had to engage with a community who was in a place of complete chaos. I will tell you a little bit about the history. I'm not going to go on to it. One of the jokes they tell you about Northern Ireland is, welcome to Belfast, please turn back your watches 500 years, which is a way of saying, as Carl was saying there, that the pattern of people's experiences, the traumas of people's experiences are passed on through generations and generations in ways see the same pattern of them happening to themselves. They look at them as models of what happened to other people and as recurrences, but also of reminders of how they should resist or how they can resist. And I suppose this question of the maintenance of a relationship of what I would call hostility and security in Ireland has been so long. Now, there's a way of talking about that which is self-pitying because it has gone on such a long time. There's another way of saying that we've been actually, and it's globally, intensely lucky. And by that I mean that the dynamics that we have worked with and lived with in Ireland and latterly in Northern Ireland have killed better people than us. We have been held in a kind of a stasis between the persistence of this relationship, our inability to resolve it, and also being held back by a fairly powerful state apparatus from actually acting on some of the passions and sense of injury that drives people in the other direction. So in a strange sense, one of the reasons I think people turn to Northern Ireland is because we have sat in this kind of halfway house for so long. It's almost as if you can see all of the moments of conflict are about simultaneously. You talk about the terriblenesses, you talk about reconciliation, you talk about these things, and it may eventually disappear. But I suppose to turn a terrible negative into a positive, what I want to say to you is this is a report from the front of what it looks like if you are in a community in which the primary structuring element of politics is conflict. Primary conflict is over a question of, which is very hard to resolve, which is be or not to be, that question. Because people feel that in the resolving of this conflict, something is at stake which we call identity, which is that they will not be the same if they lose. They do not have a future if they lose. That winning this conflict is actually coeval with existing at all. And actually, one of the most interesting, I'm kind of cutting to a little bit to what I want to say, is one of the most interesting outcomes of this process has been that it offered at least a glimpse of something else. It offers this glimpse that the project should be something in which everybody can find a place. There is some notion which the policy document, shared future. How can we talk about a shared future together? And the glimpse of that actually, in my experience, made people frightened. In other words, without our enemy, who are we? Got so long, we've spent so long in a kind of intensive conflict that actually our own identities are wrapped up in continuing to understand ourselves in relation to our enemy, other. And that peace is a foreign country. Peace is a foreign country. It is an invitation into something we do not know. It is, and that is why, in a sense, constantly trying to enforce on the other what we already know has turned into a terrible cul-de-sac. Actually being invited into a bigger choice, which is either we continue that process or we have to start on a journey into something we do not know. And so it is the land of figure it out. It is the land of learn. It is the land of listen. It is the land of engage. It is the land of experiment. Because actually, anybody who tells you that they know what the recipe is, pass it on to me. Because the recipe is a vision in front of us, something in front of us. Peace is not something any more than justice. We know what it is. We know what we're looking for. And we might know it when we get there. But what we have to do is we can't live without them in front of us. But we have to understand they won't be made unless we engage with it. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about civil society, and I suppose that's a very general sense to a very general word for anybody who does something outside of the government at a very general level. And the reason for that, I suppose, is because my own history has been very much with people who were trying things. They hadn't a clue, actually, what would come out of it. They, in some senses, they had to learn and began to develop patterns of these things matter and learn from people who came to us from abroad and learn to us that learn from each other, different circumstances, and try to create principles which would work across the board and be more sensible than that. That was the order of events. I was born, just a little bit of personal history, in a very strange place. One of the things is probably you can't, because we're not differently coloured but skin, cannot tell whether I'm a Protestant or a Catholic by looking at me. I'm by background a Protestant. I am Protestant still. And that is a set of language which marks you. In Northern Ireland, everybody in Northern Ireland works out who you are very quickly through a whole series of cultural signals which give you within 3 sentences or 5 sentences who somebody is and where they come from, and you have them summed up. Because we live in a security relationship in which it is important to know who the other person is before you start disclosing what you're going to disclose, decide what you're going to disclose. That security relationship, in fact, is everything. And even people who say, I arrive in Northern Ireland and never do that. Because we live in a phrase, in a context of needing to know who the other is because we don't know that we trust them. I lived in a context where my parents, I suppose, really were part of an organisation, and Michael's already referred to, called Coromila. And it was a small ecumenical gesture at a time when to be ecumenical was extremely radical. It was to actually deliberately set up a camp on the front line. And so at some stage or other, and it was for me as a child, what would I say, it was a very protective context in the sense that I simply lived in a place called Northern Ireland without really living in Northern Ireland. I lived in Northern Ireland in a very strange place. 2 things. First of all, because there was no immediate distinction between, on the basis of friendship between me on these issues. So crossing that line became actually something of personal importance. Not done in group work, by the way. It was done simply by growing up in context. Second one was conflicts are alienating, in the sense that people who are not in them go away, and the people who are in them become absolutely obsessed with them. People are nervous about the violence, and that obsession in our community made us extremely inward-looking. We talk about it as if it's the only conflict in the world, as if it's the only thing that exists. And I lived in a place where actually lots of people were outside. That was extremely, extremely important, I realised too. Not actually, funnily enough, and I want to talk about this, because they had all the answers, but because actually they asked slightly different questions or had slightly different experiences, which allowed us to escape from our narrow binary possibilities. So what I want to say is, outsiders who come along, simply meet you, bring what they have to offer, and then say, and you take what you can out of that and use what you can out of that, were extremely helpful to us. I have to say, we could not have survived without them. Somebody who came and was not part of our account holding basis of mathematics, you do this and I do that. That was very helpful. It opened it up. They asked us, what was not helpful? People coming from outside telling you, here's the recipe and this is what you should do. That set up a new competition between me and them about who knew life. That wasn't very helpful. So what I would say to you is this, is we really need each other. It's really, 2 things. First of all, it's really interesting to me. I've mentioned this several times. I've come to the States quite a few times, of course of my life. And in every previous occasion, I've had the feeling I'm explaining something, and it does give a certain insight into the human condition, because we all have our insights into the human condition. But I'm the object of interest, rather than what is it that you know that might be of interest to us because we now have an issue. And I think this is a healthier relationship. That means that includes you telling me to go away and stop telling you think that I think I know about yours. I may not. All I can tell you is a little bit about what we did and what I did, and what we as a community tried to do within civil society, and then say to you, maybe if we have to start talking to each other, the healing conversations that Michael is talking about, and the very graphic way in which he laid out the circumstances in which this is happening this morning, maybe it might throw some light on it, which might offer a little bit of that room people give me in my life. So I hope that that's the case. Right, because I really could talk for Ireland forever. These are slides, and this is, I suppose, a very academic way about this. Actually, for me, they're more aid memoirs for me, so you don't need to look at them. You can just look at me unless they're helpful to you. But bottom line, look at me. Yeah, there we go. Children would like it. That's me lost. I think, I suppose I just wanted to say what do we mean by this? I don't want them to be seen as separate domains, civic and the political. I think they're in dialogue. They're both parts of the way we need to express ourselves, and each gives the other possibilities. Each gives the other possibilities. If you lose that dialogue, it actually becomes slightly arid conversation in a room. So all of these conversations are both, what civil society offers is a number of different things. The agency that civil society can have is partly created by the agency that political society allows it. And so there is an interaction between those things. There is there is something where some of these dialogues happen with permission, in which case it's possible to allow them to happen, or they happen against permission. Much more complicated and in much more difficult circumstances. I suppose what I do hope is that if we can even diagnose that there's a problem that we're talking to other, we give permission to explore. Because actually one of the things that I think we did get, which other conflicts weren't allowed, was at least some room to begin to explore some of the ways in which we move forward with each other. And that is why there's been this multiplication of things. We had a moment of relatively, and I mean globally relative, benign situation in which it was possible to begin to discuss, and in which it was possible to think, possible to act at least a little bit. I also have criticism, which is that without that permissive environment, it becomes really, really difficult. That requires maturity on the part of a political system to say, we have to exist, we have to have an innovative arm, we have to allow this to occur. And maybe the American Constitution has that possibility, which is that even if we don't agree, we have to now set up this possibility of engagement with one another on some of these really tough issues. I said yesterday, I was looking at, well, what can they do? For me, political society is about permission and what do you permit and what do you prohibit? Cut in and what do you cut out? Who do you cut in, who do you cut out? Who gets banned and who gets not? Those are really important questions. They have lawmaking and decision making, they have boundary setting responsibility, they have closure responsibility around when decisions are taken. They have formal procedures tend to work. They have a power of enforcement. We give them that power of enforcement, and they have numbers. But at some level or other, the health of our political society is partly measured by the quality of the civil society that exists above it. So this is something which is not outside of political society. This is something which is really part of the health of our society. So this is about rescuing the health of our community, what Michael was talking about this morning. How do we rescue the health of the whole? And then on the other side, I put and these are false dichotomies, of course, but nevertheless, I think that question of doing things not because you have to, but you can, very big difference. Commitment, themselves in the line, creates a difference in the way they budget their time, their energy. They think about what is important. I think that doesn't get done. That I'm going to do this anyway. I think risk appetite. I think it's possible to take risks when the whole isn't at risk. Possible to take risk. I think it's society steps into the risk space, environment space. You don't have to do things by the book. Different, and actually that is actually very useful. It's very important somehow or other. And civil society work in creating that space as well. Power of engagement rather than enforcement. You have no enforcement power. Different type of a way. And that actually is something which society always do, but it is, when it's in the enforcement, it's never going to happen. So there's something that doesn't happen in space unless civil society gets to be in the conversation, creating that conversation. And then this issue, which I'll come back to, but I actually think rather than numbers, we have to decide whether our societies are about numbers or about people. Numbers serve the people or the people. That actually in the data, the big data, first we're living, really important. What's the order? Because all this chat about outcome-based accountability, and outcome must be to do with this. It has to be what happens for people. Did the numbers work? Create a better life for people. I work with the police on trying to develop a new approach. And you always have to tell the cops, no, actually, the measure of your success is whether there's no crime, not whether you turned up 99 times the last hour. It's actually whether people feel safe enough that they're actually relating to each other in a different way. So your job is like all professionals, to put yourselves out. Their job, to take myself in the book, my job is not to turn up at the lectures to learn anything. The measure of the accountability is in another, not in me. I don't control it. I just have to throw myself on the book. I'm not a good teacher. Turn up every week. Good teacher because back to me and learn something. That's interesting. That's where the outcome is. So it's both. I suppose what I'm trying to say to you is, don't knock civil society. Don't knock the possibilities that exist there just because they're not powerful. I'm absolutely sure that the power of example, power of experiment, power of engagement are things which actually aren't actually being rivaled with in political power. They're actually so it's important to say that. A little bit about Ireland, and I really will try and stop this for 5 minutes. The expansion, Ireland is an interesting case study because it is actually part of imperial history in Europe. The conquest of Ireland did not result in the assimilation of Ireland into Britain. It was perceived as an incoming force outside, and the reason why that was part religious. It was because the churches would not assimilate with each other, and the churches became the vehicles. The Catholic native population regarded this was sufficiently resistant to this Protestant incoming and provided a sufficient opposition that it survived. And over time, and in the way religion, and gradually this mark of why people were to be, it created a new population, people who now saw themselves as Irish in contradistinction to being British. But you see on that map that the northeastern part of it was a different kind of an experience. It was partly actually the orange bit on the east because it was easy to come to. It's a bit close to Scotland, and what happened there was the local war, which mentioned from Scotland, and as a result of that, they got a parcel of land. They put their people on it. There was less displacement of people in that context. But in the bit beside it, there was a war in which the Gaelic leaders were defeated. They ran off the Catholic courts of Europe to get some support, and that was regarded as an act of high treason. And so they took their land and they gave it to their mates. And told them to settle it, but they were in a very exposed place. The big issue with the settlement in Ireland is that the settlers were never safe. They were never safe. Died the external power to secure them. So it wasn't like America. It's very time parallel with America, actually. It's 7, Jamestown, 1608-hour things. It's all very parallel with the United States. But just to say, the settlement in that northeast, particularly outside that orange zone, was very much felt as a exposure. It wasn't there, and very quickly as exposure. As soon as the state disappeared, there was massive evidence of violent resistance to the settlers. So they developed a sense in themselves, as in mass killing, and they developed in themselves that one, they were at genocidal risk, and two, that they were that the reason for this was Catholicism. Religion started to play a role in creating a framework which it was possible not only to turn this into a conflict about land and politics into a conflict about ethics. We're the good guys. Everybody's the good guys. And part of our problem here is we all agree on who's responsible for our conflict. Them. Them. At that point, have that frozen to the entire structure of society, which it really did become frozen as a cleavage. It means the problem with them being responsible is they have to change. I don't change. It's entirely passive. It entirely requires an overpowering them. The result of that is that we froze into, and the problem with overpowering, when you can't overpower, as we were stuck in a kind of a impacted conflict, was that over 500 years, all the attempts to overpower one another have frozen into what we call history. What we call history. What we call history is all the efforts on all sides of the equation to do this, in which on the Catholic side, a deep sense of still, that this is a alien intervention, land was taken away, that this was second-class life since then, and on the Protestant side, this sense that, in fact, they only took it because they were themselves under threat from Catholic Europe, that that when they took it, they became under genocidal threat, and that in fact it was not a land grab in that sense. It was a normal response to a military situation. So you can decide you prefer one history than the other, and people do, I have to say, but that's not the point. The point here is that they are both motivated to defend themselves to the death. So, not us. And the issue here of nationalism is that I just want to say, language of us and them doesn't do it. Somebody talked about enemies and loving enemies and so on. I think it's really, really important, because we transmuted from us and them, which is, in my view, a statement of difference, to a statement of enmity, statement of hostility, either friend or foe. I can only exist if I defeat my enemy. And if you move from us and them to friend or foe, then actually success looks like eliminating your enemy. And part of our problem is, if the escalation in the United States is now from us and them to friend and foe, if it's always been our friend and foe, in fact, and it's just escalating into another space, more likely, then our in a relation, actually, it's what we call the zero-sum game. I can only succeed if you lose, vice versa. And we do have that deeply in the politics of Northern Ireland, where I am. What that basically means is you concede nothing. Everything that's a concession, a situation in which you put yourself at risk. And let me just say one last thing about that, because I normally go into this and I have so much to say that I just be careful here. But this is important enough. If we're friends and foes, equality is impossible. A friend and foe, equality. Because you can't be equal with somebody who you thinks going to kill you. You have to remove the threat. To remove the threat, you have to have a bigger power than they have. So the bottom line of our problem here is, we then get into a loop: equality first, then we'll not be friends and foes. Friends and foes first, or equality friends, or will not be friends, equality first, and will not be friends and foes. End the enmity, and then we'll do equality. That becomes another round in the game of you go first. Another round in the game. What I really want to say that is the goal of equality at the end of this. If we're friend and foe, the resistance to friend and foe is partly a resistance to equality, and on the other side, the resistance to equality is partly a resistance. I cannot bear, or I cannot stand it. That argument is very, very powerfully escalate the fear. Okay, so territorial solution. The political settlement was never stable. Democracy created an issue around Catholic Ireland. Really rallied very largely around this issue. We want an independent country. Protestant reaction to that was under no circumstances to be going into Catholic Ireland because it would not be free. Authoritarian society at this stage ruled by ultramontanism, the central authority of the papacy. They'll ruin us, and they'll ruin our economy, and they'll ruin everything. And so the British, at a certain stage, decided that the bigger issue was how do you get out of this mess. They imposed effectively a settlement that worked for them on the situation by creating territorial division. Didn't solve the religious conflict. It into two different ways. You have a Northern Ireland, or Southern Ireland, which does become essentially an independent country. 26 counties of Ireland is now Ireland, or the Republic of Ireland, and it is 95% Catholic country. 95% Catholic country. Its form of what we call sectarianism is essentially, I don't have to think about you. You're too small. You don't matter. But inside Northern Ireland, there was a Protestant majority, 65%, but a very large Catholic minority. And that wasn't a Catholic minority that could be pushed aside. That was too big. That minority organised, in a sense, in distinction against the state, didn't want it ever to happen, regarded it as an imposition on it, and listed. And that was used, it's interesting, I now say Unionists were global pioneers. Unionists had control of their parliament, that's the Protestants. They said, right, we face a mortal enemy. That mortal enemy is determined to destroy us, destroy our culture, destroy us, and eventually get rid of us. Number two, normal law will not solve this. People who think that you can solve this are either naive or they're fellow travellers with the rebels. And that is the logic. They called it special powers in Northern Ireland. It's the logic of Homeland Security. Now called Homeland Security. These people are out to get us. They will not be solved by normal law. If you don't believe that, you're... But at some level or other, they're reacting like everybody who under defensive situations reacts. Of course, for the people on the other side, this looks like democracy. What is the democracy in this situation where we are treated not only as second-class citizens, but as a security threat to the state? We cannot be treated as equal. Logic of that. We're a security threat to the state. So you're locked into a security relationship in our community, which people are born into. Because they're treated on the basis of superficial characteristics as assumed to be part of this group or assumed to be part of that group. Does that make sense? It locks it in. Every time somebody says in the Republican or the Catholic community, they say, we must get out of this, we have to have liberation from it. It turns violent. It has turned violent, of course. That's part of our armed tradition. It turns violent. Protestants go, told you, they're out to destroy us. We need more security. More security means this really harsh hand of the law. Down on the Catholic community goes, democracy, what the actual. They say, we must resist further. The resistance comes further. The Protestant community says, not only are they trying to stab us in the back, they're trying to stab us in the front. We must now have full frontal, actual attacks in these places. Away they go. Round we went. 1969, numbers were small, and the British state was standing back so far and didn't take that. The bottom line of that was we had 30 years of round and round the loop. I grew up on 30 years of round and round the loop, but also of external powers, Britain in particular, but Ireland as well, not thinking it was part of our story, but not really, trying to stay as far away as possible. Laws which kind of isolated Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, had to have passports stopped and sent back to Northern Ireland if you were going to Britain, had a whole things of special laws that applied only in Ireland, etc., etc. If you wanted to fly from London to Belfast, had to go through to get there, and we of violence every day. I just up with everything. That's what was. So I'm not going to go any further than that. Just to say that is our context. That's the background against which when you're talking about building, it's what possibilities do we have here? And as I say, we had certain advances here. Just this is one last diagram about this, and then I will stop about Northern Ireland apart from. We have the blues on that line are the people who identify with the government. They see the state as theirs. The other people, the reds, see that as not theirs. They're the excluded group. And the violence between them, internally, they know each other as individuals, each other as people who are different and who can talk to. Between each other, they never speak. Never speak, because what dominates is which side of these arrows they're on. Side of this violence that they're on. And once the violence happens, that's what happens. It impacts. And once it becomes your core relationship, that core relationship starts to define everything. Part of the problem, and part of what I agree with Michael's urgency in the conversation, is we need to get this early. We need to do it now. Because doing it later, as you said, climate change crisis made the thing worse. Everything will make the thing worse. It'll be more to forget. The later you go, the more there will be. That's not the slightest. Not in the slightest about that. For me, gigantic. They're gigantic. And that will require quite an so say that attempts sorted out by the government to politics ceased to have any answers about resolving anything. They only had an answer about holding all they had. They're having to while they're doing it. So that is not really. There were numbers of efforts in politics, which there was I think, Carl who said, people who are in power don't give up power very easily, or don't like giving up. Like the street protest, there was a really big street movement. And where people said, what happened? On the street. And it got destroyed because that picture I gave you. I think what should be done about people who were arrested in IRA? Were they responding to an attack on them, or were they? Because we couldn't agree on that, they all split and it all disappeared. Then kicked in. And actually, one of the reasons politics, at some level or other, decided well enough for that. Now, the big question, all of us is, how safe is that now in our world? Nevertheless, the argument authority begin to do need to be read. Okay, so just the Irish peace deal. In theory, the British government is order in Ireland. Irish government has always said, sing the songs, 4 green fields, we want Ireland back. It's very important. In fact, shut the door behind you and grab. And their attempt at that created a kind of an alliance. But America and the United States have the full political power. The only problem is I couldn't get a job because of who I was. So, because in fact, what it means is shared future is easy. Shared future requires us to believe the far side of revenge. Far side of revenge. And that is where the civil society kicks in. Because politics can do so much. Politics, the Good Friday Agreement is important architectural for a political. Good Friday Agreement. So, I want to say some things about civil society. Let's be very clear. Civil society isn't bad either. Society has possibilities. There's a lot of our civil society in it. Lots of parts of civil society was organised on the same lines as everybody else. Not about society was bad. Society has anywhere else. Paramilitarism and armed groups were regularized to that violence outside the law has become that happens the way that they do elsewhere, because paramilitaries were seen as partly defensive of armed groups. So when Thompson said armed groups against have a legacy. Armed groups are also not held to norm at the same simultaneously. The complex picture. Once armaments find this, I imagine, some of this they're both tolerated and presented because they're internally coercive. Communities provided the community level of this, basic services, community education, some employment, groups of people organised in different ways, women's groups, youth groups, area-based groups, all organised in a certain way. There were also large-scale, big charities run by 501, but which were dealing with the community. Most of them tried to just tiptoe around it. In other words, not take a view, not discuss any of these issues, try to be the state, very unusually, divided. In other words, it continued to provide the welfare services. That's why we didn't collapse. It continued to collect taxes. It didn't actually provide security, but it's kind of a half and half situation in our context. And the real happened is the law and order situation. What does it represent when the state tries to intervene as the new referee? And that's what you have. So that was the real front line for us. So where does civil society begin to play some kind of, where does it play some kind of? So first of all, where did they? This is where it was sustainable in some barricades, but in some religious organizations, faith statement that love our enemies. So there are resources inside Christian society that in the religious tradition with Christianity about loving enemies at times provided something in. Children and young people invest in their future of their children matters to them. They know that they can't ask their children. Children and young people provide a space in which people can find some bigger than currently is. Certainly allows them to take steps towards trying to find meaning. The economy, live. So finding generated plank. Not going to resolve it, by the way, but it's a plank under the foot. And universities, academia, some of its avoidance, okay? And other space provided at least because of certain things in the have a commitment of evidence-based activity, of engaging with across differences. They provided opportunities for exploring. Cultural possibilities, best language, other forms of language where other things are brought onto either experientially or in response to things. So arts that provided, cultural spaces provided something which is important, bigger. And they're all, if you going down big commitments into this, because these civil societies don't just operate on loyalty, organize on something else. They report, they're accountable to something else. And in civil society, you have so you have something else, some freedom in that, some of these groups, and shared campaigning issues, things like housing, things like issues of poverty, or sometimes provide frameworks within which people can meet in complex and different. These were just some examples of some of the things. And sometimes these are resources onto something. Here this I'm not going to go by the agreement. Actually, I'm going to get rid of that because it's stuck in that forever. After the question of what became anything, as we start on this, let me, rather than close down, I think it's a short-term activity. It's not. It's the beginning of it. He discovered that everything was impacted by these things. That it wasn't just violence was our problem. All the things that violence rested on and grew from were going to have to be part of our conversation. Couldn't necessarily have to take politics is obvious. Planning for us is still a really difficult thing because people are separated from each other in our community, live separated. All the issues around decent justice on an everyday basis by the state. How is the state held to the same mechanisms held to rights laws approved for us because our state is itself subversive. Paramilitarism, the issue of armed conflict, how do you do that? And all of these things, by the way, started on the. All of them still exist. They exist 20 years later. Education of our children are designed after because the churches were given control. Segregation. And so the question is not, not necessarily to be, how do people, how does that happen? Culture, history, sport, these are the areas in which every so issues of who gets into the middle, what is the story of our country? What is the story of our country? Who diagram what is, and we have got, we're coming to a decade of events, 100 years after decisive events, which, and all of them were violent, and all of them were one-sided. And so actually one of them was the word celebrator mark. Second of all, that mark third of all, that's just taken further because the confidence, right, I think, basically, last one, cumulatively, we've got over quite a lot. Celebrate that one, depending on who was in charge, what was going on. Symbolic rituals. Provided with that, but it just gives, there are lots of opportunities. I find by what tools, holiday, all of this stuff. What it can't give you is tips, possibility, not thinkable again in the future. Because there's a piece which has to be done by civil society, actually, in the middle of this. And it simply can't be. Put this up. That eventually decisive. I think that transform. Question of what I don't actually believe possible. Else is has to happen. Reality. Is that as long as it's possible, get life having it. That actually is massive. So we talked about reconciliation. Not about this. For who? They try to translate very definitive elements we have to have. First of all, have to actually I would say shared ever solution has to be articulate for where I are a minute. Number two, acknowledging and have to find how hard it is. Happened. The building positive relations. In other words, emphasis not that to happen for each generation. Added thing about creating civil society, movement around society, treat this as if it happens on. Now we need to. It doesn't happen. All of us must do it as a. Don't do it because. The third one, significant cultural attitude. The ways in which that happens, part of that's about human rights, part of that's about that. And then this really big one, substantive social. How do we underpin all of that by recognizing and reconciliation anything unless it can answer the question. But these are the kind of, that's what the agenda will be. And in many ways, your list, stories, trauma, values, I took it from Michael, I photocopied it. Work. Those things seem to me to be part of that. That's what you're negotiating when you're negotiating. So, vulnerabilities, these things are the same. You'll find the vulnerabilities are the same things. They're possibilities. There they are. A new paradigm for civil society. That again, these are all the areas we have to work on. We're not just talking about meeting. We're talking about thinking about take it meeting to action. Action. Taking risks. So these are the areas which strike me as like sizing the book. Find space, and that we just get out. My work was really going in. Why does this matter to you? Diplomacy that has been able to track stuff. You know, there are things which can be said at lower level, which can then be read, and things can move. Very important for us. Peace walls. We have these big divisions. Physical about the paramilitary. We've still been found it really difficult. How do not part of that youth work as a new possibility because it's tactic. Church forums has been in that. So what I suppose I want to just say is we have loads of examples of talk about justice and rights, try to ask movement, look at discrimination, people dealing with past survivors and meetings which happen, things which you have to happen, experiments on police lines, experimentally, created school, place, work, dialogue as a process. So I really only want I think there are opportunities. Secondly, imagination. Small changes with big effects. I think that we have to believe not about the size of the experiment. It's what is its context and what is it about. Outside the zero-sum game, things which aren't just about I get, you get, but trying to make more. Drawing on these transcendental themes which are real for everybody in all time, and shared futures become imaginable. About them as hope. It's this thing about hope. Hope cannot exist entirely in it. It has to exist. Hope is something society. I don't see how it comes anywhere else. Risks. It's reactive. We're still in the security crisis. It's limited in scale. It's vulnerable. It's ineffective. Source risks that are all there. No platforming. So we and all these kind of things. Confrontation is, though it seems to me, this thing about good trouble is peace building in a society is a confrontation with the vested interest. Is a confrontation. And so, different one is, I think, a confrontation which invites them into a better world, invites us all into a better world, but you don't get to control like you're not. You don't get that. So coming around that. And very finally, what can that you again? I think renorming. In other words, thinking about handed to us, thinking it. That ability to fail, advocacy, campaigning, the capacity to bring things in. Haven't been innovation and experiment, and resistance and solidarity. Creating something where, in spite of it being a very difficult universe, it's possible to do that. And I think that in the end, it's a figure-it-out process. It's about learning, challenge. But the ownership of this not belonging to political society, this challenge. This isn't what is at stake is not who wins the next election. It's so it's for everybody. And it's about positive. I know the last slide, so we're all right. So, what should you learn? I advise it. I can't tell you what you should learn, but I thought it would take. Is that you? So, I take my opportunity. Take civic challenges seriously. Face them, don't flinch. I think what Michael said this morning. Don't avoid the security paradigm. Jobs. said, the possibility that civil society actually allows people, instead of simply risk, get something for the human going through start to make. Figure it out. Learning to do the recipe. This is all French called put together and bring. We need to share that. It's an extension program where we need the possibilities to do that together. So we share genuinely. This is what we tried. This is what worked. This is what then do. From meeting to daily meeting. And what I mean by that is there's meeting and eating, there's meeting and doing things together, there's meeting and commemoration, meeting and religious ritual, silence. Meeting is not intellectual cognitive exercise. And the possibilities of that, possibility of building that into how we think about how we do things. Mainstream, really trying our big thing. More pilots than United Airlines. We did pilots and pilots. I can give you examples of just about it. What I can't do is that just. So we have great examples, for example. What happened? We're still doing the same thing. But we have great. I would say focus also on that conversation. Politics. Not politics as party politics, but as people who have responsibility to put things into. That's their justice rate. Where take that serious. Active in really matters. It's the way in which it's possible to. Economy stupid, meaning everybody. Or how do we have a system? That's something people buy in together. Shared values. I am community founded by a man was a pastor in the British Army, and he was arrested in World War II. Taken, and he was only in his 20s, and he was taken to the front and was to be a pastor to POWs in camps, one of these camps. And camps, not just camps, there were systems of camps, so you got to move between them. And if you were a pastor, you were actually allowed to move between under regulated transport. At Germany. Not only that, got particularly hot. And so he knew there were Germans who were bad. And the place his camps were, Dresden. And in Dresden, British bombed Dresden, 150 killed in Dresden by the Allied bombs. The good guys did the bad thing that night. And he was stuck there. It wasn't that he didn't think that he was out of it. On the point, this industrial way of treating people has come to its end now. We have to find something here. So what I'm finishing on, America, very important. My view, the rest of my life, probably for the rest of my children's life. My own view is that in a world where the last 2 weeks had an essentially academic up. We're probably too late, aren't we? We've run my welcome here.
We're right about time. Does somebody have a quick question? Pedro.
Sorry, I robbed your time. I robbed you of your time. Never got that back, you know.
Sorry. What was interesting to me is listening to you from my personal Black perspective, as I hear so many parallels from conversations with people in my community and the larger American context. It just sounds like the same. And I know that there's been research about, especially in the South, Southern Black culture, that says that the Black Southern culture is actually Scotch-Irish culture, and that what the Black Americans have less in common than with Africans and Black people from other places than they do with the Scotch-Irish. And when I worked and even how, like, conflict resolution and all those other things. And when I worked at the NSA, I was told by a cultural person that the closest thing to a Black woman culturally is an Irish woman. And they explained why in the Southern American context. So I wonder if in Ireland, if there's any observation of that awareness that there's a parallel between the African American community in America and what you've been discussing, if that's that awareness is there.
So, a couple of things. First of all, I suppose for me personally, coming to African American community revelatory, partly because the way in which the community has responded to it is so impressive in many ways. So there are parallels in that which have allowed, in my own generation, people to come here and see their own circumstances in proportion, but also to be given some ideas around how to do things. So yes, there is a very, I would say, quite a powerful recognition that some of the things that are happen in the South have very deep resonance with us. Second thing I should say to you is there's a kind of a paradox in what you said, which is both warm for me and also difficult. Not for you, for me. The warm part is I do think that there's something about that hospitality culture and the way of certainly some paradoxically Baptist religion and so on that was shared and that came to it. I have to say to you, I have to be honest, which is that Scotch Irish are also on the hard racist side of the thing as well. Yep. And so I'm not here to claim that we, somehow or other, were the good guys. But what I am here to say to you is that I think that there are ways in which that's the kind of cross-fertilization where I think you have things. I think there's possibly instruments developed because of the kind of resourcing which are helpful. There are ways of understanding what it's like to be in a possible predicament given to you by history. The healing of historical harms, that whole on is something which is at the core of our conversation as well. We can't pretend it was slavery, it wasn't, but it was nevertheless a very, very persistent relationship of discrimination, antagonism and violence. And so we have to, anyway, all I'd say is I'm really glad that that connection made sense to you, but I'm also, it's something we bear in this next stage of this journey, because I also think African America is very decisive what happens here, because capacity to imagine a shared future so central to the thing, but it's so difficult exactly for the same reason. What's on the other side of that is essentially unforgivable. Essentially unforgivable.
Thank you, Duncan. Well, we can.